The rain fell heavy over Louisville that October evening in 1995, the kind of rain that made the streets shine like wet mirrors under the streetlights. Detective Marcus Webb sat in his cramped office at the Louisville Police Department, surrounded by stacks of cold case files that seemed to grow taller each year. His coffee had gone cold hours ago, forgotten on the corner of his desk next to a photograph of his late wife, taken at the Grand Canyon in happier times. 53 years old, with gray threading through his dark hair and lines etched deep around his eyes, Marcus had seen enough darkness in his career to fill several lifetimes, but nothing haunted him quite like the unsolved cases. They whispered to him at night, kept him awake, made him feel like he'd failed the victims and their families in ways that couldn't be repaired. His captain often joked that Marcus kept the cold cases alive more than the dead deserved. But everyone knew the detective's obsession came from a place of genuine pain. The Henderson case was different, though. It had become almost personal. On July 14, 1942, a warm summer night when Louisville was caught between the innocence of peacetime and the dread of an approaching war, Sarah Henderson disappeared. She was 28 years old, a school teacher with auburn hair and a smile that made people trust her instantly. Her husband, Thomas Henderson, was serving overseas with the Army. She lived with her elderly mother in a modest two-story house on Magnolia Avenue, in the quieter part of town where neighbors knew each other and doors were left unlocked without fear. Sarah had been found 3 days later in the basement of an abandoned warehouse near the riverfront, her body positioned with a gentleness that contradicted the brutality of her death. The killer had strangled her with her own silk scarf, and the medical examiner found traces of bruising that suggested she'd fought back with desperate strength. But there were no witnesses, no clear evidence, no suspects that led anywhere solid. The investigation had gone cold within months, swallowed by the machinery of a police department, overwhelmed by the chaos of wartime and a city trying to believe such horrors couldn't happen in their streets. Thomas Henderson had returned from the war a broken man. He'd spent 30 years searching for answers before passing away in 1972, never knowing who had taken his wife from him. Sarah's mother, Margaret, had died 10 years later, her heart finally giving out under the weight of the grief she'd carried for so long, but the case remained open, unsolved, a wound that never quite healed in Louisville's collective memory. Marcus had inherited the Henderson file in 1988, 7 years ago, when he'd been transferred to the Cold Cases Division. It was supposed to be an easy assignment, a stepping stone to retirement, a way to let an aging detective coast through his final years. Instead, he'd become obsessed. He'd spent countless hours reading the original investigation files, studying the photographs, interviewing the few people still alive who remembered those days. He'd traveled to neighboring counties, tracked down distant relatives, chased down rumors and hearsay. His captain had warned him to be careful, to not let the dead consume the living. But Marcus couldn't let it go. The breakthrough had come 3 weeks ago, almost by accident. Marcus had been reorganizing the evidence locker, a thankless task assigned to him as punishment for ignoring his captain's warnings, when he'd noticed something odd about the Henderson file. A piece of evidence had been misfiled, a single item that should have been logged in 1942 but had ended up in the wrong box. It was a leather wallet, aged and cracked with initials carved into its back. RM. The wallet contained a receipt from a Louisville diner, dated the day before Sarah Henderson disappeared. And it contained a photograph of a young man, no more than 25, with sharp features and eyes that seemed to look directly at the camera with unsettling intensity. On the back of the photograph, someone had written in faded ink, Raymond Massey, 1942. Marcus's hands had trembled as he'd held that wallet. 53 years of wondering. 53 years of wondering why this evidence had never been connected to the case. He'd pulled every record he could find on Raymond Massey and discovered that the man had died in 1987. A quiet death in a nursing home in Lexington, Kentucky, 45 miles away. Massey had lived a seemingly unremarkable life after 1942. Had married, had children, had grandchildren who knew him as a quiet, reserved grandfather who sometimes had dark moods, but was otherwise unremarkable. But when Marcus had finally tracked down Massey's medical records from his time in the military, the same military Sarah's husband had served in, he'd found something crucial. Massey had been in Louisville in July 1942. He'd been stationed at Fort Knox, just 30 miles south, and according to interviews with his old Army buddies, Massey had been obsessed with Sarah Henderson. He'd seen her at church, had spoken to her a few times, and had become convinced that she would leave her husband for him if only Thomas would disappear. The pieces had started to fit together like a puzzle that had been scattered for half a century. Marcus had worked with forensic specialists over the past 3 weeks, using modern DNA technology that hadn't existed in 1942. They'd tested the wallet, tested the photograph, and had found traces of biological evidence that had survived decades in the evidence locker. The DNA matched with samples from Raymond Massey's medical records still on file. They had their killer finally. 53 years later, they had proof. Now on this rainy October evening, Marcus sat at his desk preparing the final report. Massey's body had been exhumed 2 days ago, and additional testing was underway. The evidence would be presented to the district attorney in the morning. There would be a press conference. The community would finally know who had taken Sarah Henderson from them all those years ago. Marcus looked at the photograph of Sarah Henderson that sat in the center of his desk. She was smiling in that picture, taken at a church social just weeks before her death. She had no idea that her life would be cut short by someone's obsession, by someone's inability to accept rejection. She had no idea that her husband would spend decades looking for answers. She had no idea that nearly 100 years would pass before the truth would finally be revealed. He picked up the old photograph of Raymond Massey from the wallet and studied the young man's face. Whatever demons had lived in Massey's mind had died with him 13 years ago. Whatever pain or rage had driven him to take Sarah Henderson had been buried in his grave. But now, finally, the community would know. Now, finally, the Henderson family would have answers. Now, finally, Sarah could rest knowing that her killer had been named, identified, and brought to justice, even if that justice came so very, very late. Marcus leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. Outside, the rain continued to fall on Louisville, washing the streets clean as it had done for 53 years, carrying secrets, keeping silence, protecting murderers until the truth found a way to surface, no matter how long it took. The press conference was scheduled for 10 a.m. on a Tuesday morning in late October. Marcus had barely slept, his mind cycling through every possible outcome, every potential complication. He'd spent 30 years as a detective, had testified in countless trials, had faced aggressive defense attorneys and skeptical juries. But this felt different. This wasn't just another case closing. This was history being rewritten, a shadow finally being cast by the light of truth. He arrived at the police headquarters early, finding Captain James Thornton already in his office, reviewing the files one last time. Thornton was a political creature, the kind of police captain who understood that a high-profile case solved could make careers or break them. He'd been skeptical of Marcus's obsession with the Henderson case for years. But now, with the DNA evidence solid and the narrative compelling, Thornton saw opportunity. "The mayor's office wants to make a statement," Thornton said, not looking up from the files. "They're calling this a triumph of modern detective work. They want to emphasize that no criminal is beyond reach, no matter how much time has passed." Marcus nodded, but something in his chest tightened. The Henderson case wasn't a triumph. It was a failure that had taken 53 years to partially correct. Sarah Henderson was still dead. Thomas Henderson had died without knowing who killed his wife. The real triumph would have been solving this in 1942, when the case was fresh, when justice could have meant something immediate and present to the people who loved her. "There's something else," Thornton continued, finally looking up at Marcus with an expression that suggested he was about to deliver unwelcome news. "Raymond Massey's family has retained a lawyer. They're already preparing a statement claiming that the evidence is circumstantial, that DNA degradation over 53 years is unreliable, that we're scapegoating a dead man who can't defend himself." Marcus felt his jaw clench. He'd anticipated this, of course. Massey's family had lived their lives believing in the respectability of their patriarch, a quiet man who'd raised a family, worked steadily, attended church on Sundays. The revelation that he was a murderer threatened to unravel the entire narrative of their lives. But what they didn't understand was that by protecting Massey's memory, they were dishonoring Sarah Henderson's grave all over again. "The evidence is solid," Marcus said quietly. "The DNA is—" "I know," Thornton interrupted. But you need to be prepared for pushback. The media is already digging into Massey's background. His granddaughter gave an interview to Channel 5 last night, crying about how her grandfather was a good man, how this accusation was destroying her family's reputation. People are going to sympathize with her. They're going to see a grieving granddaughter defending her family's honor, and they're going to see you as an old detective trying to close a case by dragging a dead man through the mud. The words hit harder than Marcus had expected. He'd never considered himself a mud dragger. He'd always thought of himself as a seeker of truth, someone willing to fight for justice even when the cost was personal. But Thornton was right. To the public, to Massey's family, to anyone who hadn't lived with the Henderson case for 7 years, this would look like something else entirely. It would look like a witch hunt. It would look like blaming a dead man because he couldn't fight back. The press conference began at 10:15 a.m. in the main auditorium of police headquarters. Television cameras lined the back wall. Reporters crowded into the front rows, cameras flashing like small explosions of light. The mayor stood at the podium, flanked by Thornton and Marcus. Behind them, displayed on a large screen, was a photograph of Sarah Henderson, smiling that same smile from the church social. It was meant to be powerful. It was meant to remind everyone why this case mattered. But as Marcus looked out at the sea of faces, he saw something he hadn't anticipated. He saw skepticism. He saw the kind of careful evaluation that suggested people weren't quite convinced. He saw journalists already calculating angles, already thinking about how this story would be received by the public, already wondering if there was a more compelling narrative to be told than the simple truth. The mayor spoke first, offering platitudes about justice and modern police work. Thornton followed, outlining the evidence in careful, measured language designed to seem authoritative without being accusatory. Then Marcus stepped forward. He'd prepared a statement. He'd rehearsed it a dozen times. But as he looked at Sarah Henderson's photograph, as he thought about Thomas Henderson spending 30 years searching for answers, as he considered the weight of 53 years of silence, Marcus found himself abandoning the prepared remarks. Sarah Henderson was 28 years old when she was murdered, he began, his voice steady. She was a teacher. She was a wife waiting for her husband to come home from war. She was a daughter. She was a person with dreams and potential and a future that was stolen from her. For 53 years, her killer walked free. He lived a life. He had a family. He died of natural causes in his bed, something Sarah Henderson never got to do. Marcus paused, letting the words settle. He could feel Thornton's discomfort beside him, could sense the mayor's calculation about whether this statement was helping or hurting the narrative. We have DNA evidence linking Raymond Massey to the crime scene. We have historical documentation placing him in Louisville at the time of the murder. We have testimony from people who knew Massey was obsessed with Sarah Henderson. But what we don't have is certainty. What we don't have is the ability to ask Massey why he did what he did. What we don't have is the chance to see him face justice in a courtroom, to hear his defense, to give him the opportunity to explain himself. And that's what haunts me more than anything else about this case. The room fell silent. The cameras continued to flash, but the reporters seemed frozen, uncertain how to react to a detective essentially admitting the limitations of his own investigation. What we do have, Marcus continued, is the truth. Sarah Henderson deserves that truth. Her family deserves that truth. This city deserves that truth, even if it comes 53 years too late. After the press conference, Marcus retreated to his office to find his phone already ringing. Messages flooded in, from journalists wanting interviews, from people who claimed to have information about Massey, from members of the Henderson family expressing both gratitude and pain. But there was one message that made Marcus's blood run cold. It was from a lawyer representing Massey's family. The message was terse and professional. We are considering filing a lawsuit against the Louisville Police Department for defamation. Your accusations against our client have caused significant emotional distress to his surviving family members. We expect to hear from your department's legal counsel within 48 hours. Marcus stared at the message, feeling something inside him shift. He'd been so focused on finding the truth that he hadn't fully considered the cost of revealing it. The Massey family wasn't going to accept this quietly. They were going to fight. They were going to use every tool available to them to protect their patriarch's memory, to cast doubt on the evidence, to make Marcus himself the villain in their story. And as the day wore on, as more messages came in, as the media narrative began to shift, Marcus realized something that made him feel older than he'd ever felt before. Solving a case and achieving justice weren't always the same thing. Sometimes the truth just opened new wounds. Sometimes, pursuing justice meant becoming the instrument of pain for people who were innocent of the original crime, but guilty of loving someone who wasn't who they thought he was. The Henderson case, it seemed, was far from over. It was only just beginning. The offices of Massey and Associates law firm occupied the entire 14th floor of the Egon Center in downtown Louisville. The name itself was ironic. The firm had been founded by Raymond Massey's son David, who'd inherited not just his father's name but apparently his sense of entitlement as well. David Massey was 68 years old, a prominent attorney with connections that ran deep through Kentucky's political and judicial systems. He was not someone who took accusations against his family lightly. Marcus received the summons 3 days after the press conference. He was being sued for defamation, tortious interference, and emotional distress. The lawsuit alleged that Marcus had made false and malicious statements regarding Raymond Massey's character, without sufficient evidence, that he had allowed personal obsession to override professional judgment, and that the resulting media attention had caused severe and lasting harm to the Massey family's reputation. The amount being sought was substantial, $500,000. Captain Thornton called an emergency meeting in his office. Present were Thornton, the department's legal counsel, and Marcus. The legal counsel, a thin man named Richard Stratton with nervous eyes and a habit of tugging at his tie, looked deeply uncomfortable. "The evidence is solid," Marcus said before anyone else could speak. The DNA is also 53 years old," Stratton interrupted. "And Massey's family has already hired expert witnesses who will testify that DNA evidence from that era is unreliable, subject to contamination, and insufficient for a definitive identification. We can win this case, Detective Webb, but it's going to be expensive and it's going to be ugly." "We're not backing down," Thornton said, but his voice lacked conviction. Marcus could see it in the captain's face. The calculation had shifted. What had seemed like a triumph of detective work now looked like a potential liability. What had looked like a case that would boost the department's reputation now looked like it might damage it. Over the next week, the media narrative began to change. What had started as a story about an unsolved murder finally being solved became a story about a police department that had potentially railroaded a dead man. Massey's family hired a public relations firm, and suddenly the news was full of interviews with David Massey, expressing his grief and confusion, talking about his father as a gentleman, a devoted grandfather, someone who had never shown any sign of violence or obsession. They produced photographs of Raymond Massey in his later years, an elderly man with kind eyes and a gentle smile, surrounded by grandchildren at birthday parties and family gatherings. Sarah Henderson faded from the narrative. She became a background character in a story about how police might have made a terrible mistake. Her suffering was diminished, reframed as unfortunate but ultimately less important than protecting the Massey family's honor. Marcus found himself isolated at work. Some of his colleagues, sensing the shift in the political winds, began to distance themselves from him. Thornton stopped making eye contact. The department's public information officer started carefully hedging statements about the case, suggesting that the investigation was ongoing and that no conclusions should be drawn prematurely. Then, on a cold morning in late November, everything changed. Marcus received a phone call from a woman named Eleanor Price. She identified herself as Raymond, Massey's former neighbor from 1942. She was 91 years old and had been listening to the news coverage. She had something to tell him, but she needed to meet in person. She didn't trust phones. They met at a small diner on East Main Street, the kind of place that had probably existed since the 1950s, with red vinyl booths and a counter that gleamed dully under fluorescent lights. Eleanor Price was tiny, bird-like, with white hair and hands that trembled slightly as she lifted her coffee cup. But her eyes were sharp, alert, missing nothing. "I never said anything," Eleanor began without preamble. "All these years I never said anything. My husband told me not to get involved, that it wasn't our business. He said if I went to the police we might get tangled up in something we didn't understand. He said people who talked to the police about things like that sometimes ended up regretting it. So I kept quiet. I was 23 years old. I was scared. I let it go. Tell me, Marcus said quietly. I saw him that night, Eleanor continued. July 13th, 1942. I was taking out the trash in the alley behind our house, which was 2 blocks from the Henderson house. I saw Raymond Massey walking down the alley. He was carrying a leather bag, the kind people used for travel. But it was empty, I could tell by the way he carried it. And his hands were shaking. His shirt was torn at the collar, and he was crying. Marcus felt something shift in his chest. This was exactly the kind of evidence that wouldn't hold up in a modern courtroom, that wouldn't even be admissible. But it was the kind of evidence that meant something to the human heart. Why are you telling me this now? Marcus asked. Eleanor set down her coffee cup with a soft clink. Because I'm 91 years old and I'm tired, she said simply. Because my husband died 15 years ago, and I've carried this secret by myself ever since. Because I watched the news and I saw that girl's family talking about how they were destroyed by this accusation, and I realized that Sarah Henderson's family deserved the truth more than I deserved to keep my peace, because I'm old enough now that I understand that staying silent isn't always the same as being safe. Sometimes staying silent just means you're complicit in someone else's tragedy. Over the next 3 hours, Eleanor told Marcus everything she remembered. She talked about seeing Massey that night, about his emotional state, about overhearing a conversation weeks earlier, where Massey had talked about Sarah Henderson in terms that had made Eleanor deeply uncomfortable. She talked about how she'd tried to convince her husband to go to the police, but how he'd refused. How she'd been a woman in 1942 and had lacked the power to act alone. When they left the diner, Eleanor gave Marcus permission to use her testimony. She signed a statement. She agreed to go on record, and as Marcus drove back to police headquarters, he felt something shift inside him. This was the piece that had been missing. This was the witness whose voice had been silenced by fear and social pressure for 53 years. This was the evidence that transformed the case from one man's obsession into something that bore the weight of multiple witnesses and corroborating details. That evening, Marcus typed up Eleanor's statement and sent it to the district attorney, to Captain Thornton, and to the media. He included a photograph of Eleanor with her permission. He included her name. He made her visible. Within hours, the media narrative shifted again. Eleanor Price became the story. Her courage, her decades of silence, her decision to finally come forward, these became the focus of news coverage. And Sarah Henderson once again stepped out of the shadows. Her photograph appeared alongside Eleanor's. Her story was retold with new urgency, with new context, with the understanding that this wasn't about a police department making accusations against a dead man. It was about a community finally choosing to remember a victim, finally choosing to honor her memory by pursuing the truth, no matter how long it took. David Massey's public relations strategy faltered. There were no good sound bites in response to Eleanor Price's testimony. There was no way to argue that an eyewitness was unreliable without sounding defensive, without sounding like he was attacking an elderly woman for daring to tell the truth. Marcus watched as the lawsuit was quietly withdrawn. Massey's legal team released a statement suggesting that they were dropping the case out of respect for Eleanor Price's difficult position, but everyone understood what was really happening. They were retreating. They were accepting defeat. That night, Marcus sat in his apartment and watched the evening news coverage. Eleanor Price was being interviewed by one of the local stations. She was talking about the importance of speaking up, about how silence can be a form of violence, about how sometimes we have to choose between comfort and conscience. As Marcus listened to her words, he felt something release inside him. The case wasn't closed. There would still be investigations, still be questions, still be the complex legal machinery of bringing a cold case to some form of resolution, even though the perpetrator was long dead. But the truth had found its voice. The victim's story had been restored to its proper place at the center of the narrative. He picked up his phone and opened his text messages. He typed out a message to everyone in the department, to Thornton, to Stratton, to the officers who'd helped with the investigation. We did it. Not because we were right, but because we were persistent. Not because we were powerful, but because we refused to let the dead be forgotten. Then he added a personal note that would be sent out to all the media contacts who'd been covering the case. If you're watching this and you have a story about a cold case, about an unsolved mystery, about an injustice that's been buried by time, please reach out. Please come forward. Please don't let the years of silence convince you that your voice doesn't matter, because it does. It always does. The grand jury convened on December 10, 1995, exactly 4 months after Marcus had first discovered the leather wallet in the evidence locker. The evidence was presented meticulously, the DNA analysis, the historical records placing Raymond Massey in Louisville during the summer of 1942, Eleanor Price's eyewitness testimony, the military documents, the photographs, Assistant District Attorney Sarah Chen, a sharp woman in her early 40s with a reputation for thorough preparation, walked the jurors through each piece of evidence with surgical precision. But there was a problem that no amount of evidence could fully solve. Raymond Massey was dead. He had been dead for 13 years. The grand jury could indict him posthumously, could officially name him as the person responsible for Sarah Henderson's death, but there would be no trial. There would be no opportunity for Massey to defend himself in a courtroom. There would be no jury weighing evidence and reaching a verdict that would stand as legal certainty. What there would be, though, was an official record. An acknowledgement. A name attached to a crime that had haunted Louisville for over half a century. On December 15th, the grand jury returned its indictment. Raymond Massey, deceased, was officially charged with the murder of Sarah Henderson. The indictment would be sealed, standard procedure for posthumous charges, but the fact of it would be released to the media. It would be public record. It would be part of Louisville's history. Marcus stood in the courthouse hallway as the news broke. Journalists surrounded him, cameras flashing, microphones thrust toward his face. He fielded questions with the same measured responses he'd been trained to give, but inside, something was shifting. The investigation was no longer his burden alone. The case had become something larger than one detective's obsession. It had become a moment of collective reckoning. Over the following weeks, something unexpected happened. The Henderson case began to resonate beyond Louisville. News outlets picked it up as a story about the power of persistence, about how modern forensic techniques could solve mysteries that had seemed eternally buried. The case was featured in a segment on one of the national news programs. A true crime podcast reached out requesting interviews. Universities began studying the case in their criminology programs. But more significantly, other cold cases began to surface. People started calling the police department with tips, with information they'd been holding on to for decades, inspired by Eleanor Price's decision to finally speak. A murder from 1967 was solved when a witness, moved by Eleanor's testimony, came forward with information she'd kept secret for 28 years. A missing person case from 1978 was cracked when someone heard about the Henderson case and realized that what they'd seen all those years ago might finally be important. Marcus found himself becoming something he'd never expected to be, a symbol, not of police authority or judicial power, but of something more human. A symbol of the idea that justice, even delayed, even incomplete, even arriving long after everyone involved has turned to dust, still mattered. It still meant something to pursue it. 3 months after the grand jury indictment in mid-March 1996, Marcus received a visitor at the police department. Thomas Henderson's grandson, a man named Michael Henderson who was in his mid-50s, came to see him. Michael had been born after his grandfather's death, but had grown up hearing stories about the unsolved mystery, about the way Sarah's murder had shaped his family's history. They sat in Marcus's office, surrounded by the remnants of 7 years of investigation. Michael held in his hands a leather journal, worn and faded, filled with his grandfather's handwriting. It was Thomas Henderson's personal account of his search for answers, his own detective work conducted in the years following Sarah's death. Page after page contained theories, names of suspects, interviews with people who might have known something. "My grandfather kept this his whole life," Michael said, his voice thick with emotion. He never gave up. He never accepted that the case was unsolved. He couldn't move forward because there was no resolution. "My grandmother left him, you know. They divorced in 1952. She couldn't live with him anymore because all he could do was chase ghosts. He lost everything trying to find the truth about my grandmother, Sarah." Marcus felt his throat tighten. He'd known the case had affected the families, but seeing it spelled out like this in a grandson's voice made it visceral in a way that 53 years of case files never could. Michael opened the journal to a specific page. dated March 1960. It contained a passage in Thomas Henderson's careful handwriting. I know I will never have certainty. I know I will likely die without knowing who took her from me, but I cannot stop looking. If I stop looking, then her death becomes meaningless. If I stop fighting for justice, then I am complicit in letting her be forgotten. You gave him that, Michael said, looking directly at Marcus. You gave my grandfather's memory the one thing it needed most. You proved that his search wasn't futile. You proved that the person he was looking for, the person he spent his life pursuing, that person was real. That person existed. That person was Raymond Massey. My grandfather didn't get to see it, but somewhere, somehow, I think he knows. After Michael left, Marcus sat alone in his office for a long time. He thought about Thomas Henderson, spending decades chasing a ghost. He thought about Sarah Henderson, whose life had been cut short by someone's obsession. He thought about Eleanor Price, carrying the weight of a secret for 53 years before finally choosing to speak. He thought about all the cold cases, all the unsolved mysteries, all the victims whose stories had been relegated to filing cabinets and forgotten evidence lockers. And he thought about the cost of justice. The real cost, not measured in legal fees or departmental resources, but in human suffering. The cost paid by families who had to relive trauma to pursue the truth. The cost paid by witnesses who had to overcome decades of fear to come forward. The cost paid by detectives who had to carry the weight of other people's tragedies, who had to let the dead inhabit their dreams and their waking hours. The final piece of the Henderson case came in May 1996. After months of investigation and negotiation, the district attorney's office released a comprehensive report on the case. The report detailed the evidence, the investigation, and the conclusion that Raymond Massey was responsible for Sarah Henderson's death. But it also acknowledged something that Marcus had fought for from the beginning, that the case represented a failure of the original 1942 investigation, that crucial evidence had been mishandled, that systemic problems had allowed a killer to walk free for 53 years. The report included recommendations for how the police department could prevent similar failures in the future. It called for better evidence management, for more thorough documentation, for a recognition that unsolved cases required sustained attention over years, even decades. When Marcus read the report in its final form, he felt something that he hadn't experienced in years: vindication. Not the petty vindication of being proved right in an argument, but the deeper, more profound vindication of knowing that his work had mattered, that it had changed something, that it would make a difference for the next victim, for the next detective, for the next family searching for answers. But there was something else too. As Marcus sat in his office on a warm May evening, looking out over Louisville as the sun set in shades of orange and red, he felt the weight of completion. The Henderson case had consumed 7 years of his life. It had become the lens through which he saw everything: other cases, other investigations, the very nature of his work as a detective. And now finally it was done, not perfect, not complete in the way he might have wished, with Massey alive to face a jury, with a trial and a conviction and a clear legal resolution. But done. The truth was known. The victim was remembered. The killer was named. The family had closure. Marcus typed up his final report on the Henderson case, a comprehensive document that brought together everything he'd learned, everything he'd discovered, everything that had led to this moment. He included Eleanor Price's testimony, the DNA analysis, the historical documentation, the grand jury indictment. He included his own reflections on what the case had taught him about persistence, about the importance of never letting the dead be forgotten, about how justice delayed is still justice. As he wrote the final sentence, "The case of Sarah Henderson is closed," Marcus felt something shift inside him. He was no longer the detective obsessed with an unsolved mystery. He was something else now. He was a witness to the power of truth. He was a testament to the idea that the past, no matter how deeply buried, could still speak to the present. He was a man who had spent 7 years chasing ghosts and had emerged having learned that some ghosts are worth chasing, because in pursuing them, we honor the living. The letter arrived at Marcus Webb's desk on a Tuesday morning in early June 1996. It was handwritten on cream-colored stationery, the handwriting careful and deliberate, belonging to someone who took time with their words. The return address was from a law office in Lexington, Kentucky. Marcus almost didn't open it, assuming it was another legal matter related to the Henderson case. But something made him hesitate, made him look at the envelope more carefully. The name on the back was David Massey. He opened it slowly, his detective's instinct already preparing for conflict, for another lawsuit, for another legal battle. But the words that greeted him were not what he expected. Detective Webb, I have spent the last 6 months wrestling with the implications of what your investigation revealed about my father. I have defended his memory fiercely, perhaps more fiercely than I should have. I hired lawyers to fight you. I engaged public relations firms to protect my family's reputation. I told myself that I was defending an innocent man against a police department that had railroaded him, but I cannot continue to lie to myself. 3 weeks ago, I traveled to the archives at the University of Kentucky and requested access to my father's military records. I wanted to find something, anything that would prove your accusations wrong. Instead, I found a diary. It was stored in a locked box with my father's service records, and it had been overlooked in the chaos of his death and the disposition of his estate. I have now read every page of that diary. My father wrote about Sarah Henderson in terms that I cannot repeat here. He wrote about his obsession with her, his belief that she would leave her husband for him if only Thomas would disappear. He wrote about planning her murder, and most damning of all, he wrote about the act itself, in language so clear and so vivid that there is no possibility of misinterpretation. I am writing to tell you that you were right. My father murdered Sarah Henderson, and I'm writing to tell you that I am deeply, profoundly sorry for the obstruction I have placed in the path of justice. I have decided to donate my father's diary to the Louisville Police Department. I am releasing a public statement accepting the grand jury's indictment and acknowledging that my father was responsible for Sarah Henderson's death. I am not doing this to protect my own reputation or to position myself as a person of conscience. I am doing this because Sarah Henderson deserves the complete truth, because her family deserves full acknowledgement of what was done to her, and because I can no longer be complicit in the denial of that truth. I hope that one day, my family can find a way to atone for what my father did, and for what I did in trying to protect his memory. That day may never come, but I wanted you to know that the pursuit of truth, even when it destroys everything you thought you knew about your own family, is the right path. Respectfully, David Massey. Marcus read the letter 3 times, slowly, carefully, making sure he understood every word. When he finished, he sat back in his chair and allowed himself a moment of something he rarely permitted: hope. Not just hope that justice had been served, but hope that even in the aftermath of terrible truths, people could change. People could see beyond their own pain and their own need to protect themselves. People could choose to do the right thing, even when it cost them everything. He immediately called the district attorney's office and informed them of the diary. Within days, the diary was authenticated and verified. It contained not just confessions to Sarah Henderson's murder, but details that had never been released to the public. Details that could only have been known by the perpetrator. The diary was undeniable proof. It transformed the case from circumstantial evidence and eyewitness testimony into an absolute certainty. The media, sensing a new angle to the story, descended on David Massey. But instead of defending his father or making excuses, Massey held a press conference where he read excerpts from his father's diary to the assembled journalists. He wept as he read them. He acknowledged his own complicity in trying to obstruct the investigation. And he announced that he was establishing a scholarship fund in Sarah Henderson's name at the University of Louisville to be given annually to promising young women studying education. My father took something precious from the world when he murdered Sarah Henderson, Massey said, his voice breaking. She was a teacher. She was a woman of intelligence and compassion. She had a life ahead of her that was stolen by a man's obsession and rage. I cannot undo what my father did. I cannot bring her back, but I can ensure that her memory is honored, and that future generations of young women pursuing education are supported in ways that my father's victim never was. The public response was profound and immediate. Massey's acknowledgement, his donation to the scholarship fund, his willingness to name his father's crime publicly, these actions seemed to shift something in the city's collective consciousness. Sarah Henderson was no longer just a victim of an unsolved crime. She was a woman whose life mattered, whose death had meaning, whose legacy would continue through the lives of young women she would never meet. Eleanor Price received dozens of interview requests. She became in her final years something of a minor celebrity, the woman who had finally spoken the truth that had been buried for 53 years. Universities invited her to speak about the importance of bearing witness. She appeared on television programs discussing the moral courage it had taken to overcome her fear and come forward. "I spent 53 years being silent," Eleanor told one interviewer, her ancient face filling the screen with a kind of dignified resolve. "I spent 53 years telling myself that my silence was prudent, that it was wise, that it was the safer path. But I learned at 91 years old that silence isn't ever safe. Silence is just a slow way of dying while you're still alive, speaking the truth even when it's terrifying, even when it means facing judgment and pain. That's what it means to actually live." Marcus attended the dedication of the Sarah Henderson Memorial Scholarship in September 1996. It was held in the gardens of the University of Louisville, under a canopy of oak trees that had probably been standing since Sarah's time. The first recipient was a young woman named Jennifer Williams, the granddaughter of a school teacher, pursuing a degree in education. As Jennifer stood to accept the scholarship, tears streaming down her face, Marcus felt the full weight and significance of what they had all accomplished. This wasn't just about solving a cold case. It wasn't just about identifying a killer 53 years after the fact. It was about restoration. It was about taking something that had been broken and fragmented, and if not mending it completely, at least honoring its memory with something beautiful and enduring. In the months that followed, Marcus found himself reflecting on the true nature of closure. He'd spent 7 years believing that closure would come when he solved the case, when he identified the killer, when he presented the evidence and saw justice done. But he'd been wrong. Closure hadn't come in any single moment. It had come gradually in layers. It had come with Eleanor's testimony. It had come with David Massey's confession and his willingness to acknowledge the truth. It had come with the scholarship, with the young women who would now benefit from a fund created in the name of a woman who had died 75 years before they were born. In October 1996, a year after his initial breakthrough with the wallet in the evidence locker, Marcus submitted his retirement papers. He'd spent 33 years as a detective. He'd solved hundreds of cases. But it was the Henderson case, the one that had consumed the last 7 years of his career, that would define his legacy. At his retirement dinner, attended by colleagues and the officials who had supported his investigation, Marcus was given a plaque. It read, "In recognition of Detective Marcus Webb, whose commitment to justice and to the memory of victims reminds us that truth, pursued with patience and dignity, can transform even the darkest of histories." As Marcus held that plaque, he thought about Sarah Henderson, smiling in that photograph from the church social. He thought about Thomas Henderson, spending 30 years searching for answers. He thought about Eleanor Price, carrying a secret for 53 years. He thought about David Massey, destroying his own family's reputation to honor the truth. And he thought about something Eleanor had said to him during one of their final conversations. "You know what I've learned, Detective Webb? I've learned that the dead don't rest easy until we remember them. They don't rest easy until we say their names, until we acknowledge what was taken from them, until we refuse to let the world forget. That's what you did for Sarah Henderson. You made sure the world would remember her name." Marcus returned home to his quiet apartment overlooking Louisville. He placed the plaque on his mantelpiece next to the photograph of his wife, taken at the Grand Canyon so many years ago. He poured himself a glass of whiskey and sat in his favorite chair, looking out at the city lights twinkling in the darkness below. The Henderson case was closed. Sarah had been remembered. Justice, delayed though it was, had finally arrived. And Marcus Webb, who had spent a lifetime pursuing truth in the darkness, could finally rest. 23 years had passed. It was October 2019, a bright autumn afternoon in Louisville when Marcus Webb, now 79 years old, received an unexpected phone call. The voice on the other end belonged to Jennifer Williams, the first recipient of the Sarah Henderson Memorial Scholarship, whom he hadn't spoken to in over 2 decades. Jennifer was calling to invite him to a special event. She was now the principal of an elementary school in West Louisville, a school that served predominantly low-income families. She had spent her entire career in education, just as Sarah Henderson had done. and she was organizing a ceremony to commemorate the scholarship program on its 25th anniversary. "I wouldn't be here without that scholarship," Jennifer told Marcus, her voice warm with gratitude. "I wouldn't have finished my degree. I wouldn't have become a teacher. I wouldn't have been able to pursue this career that has given my life meaning. And none of that would have happened if you hadn't solved that cold case, if you hadn't pursued the truth about what happened to Sarah Henderson." Marcus attended the ceremony on a Saturday in late October. The event was held at the elementary school where Jennifer now worked. The gymnasium was filled with people, former and current scholarship recipients, their families, teachers, community members. On the walls were photographs documenting the history of the scholarship. Sarah Henderson as a young woman, Thomas Henderson in his military uniform, Eleanor Price at 91 years old, David Massey at the press conference where he had confessed the truth, and there was a photograph of Marcus, taken at his retirement dinner 23 years earlier. Looking tired but satisfied, Jennifer introduced him as the keynote speaker, describing his role in solving the Henderson case and establishing the legacy that had now supported over 100 young women in pursuing careers in education. As Marcus stood to address the crowd, he was struck by how much time had changed, how much the world had moved forward, while also feeling a strange continuity with the detective he had been all those years ago. "When I first discovered that leather wallet in the evidence locker in 1988, Marcus began, I had no idea what I was starting. I had no idea that pursuing the truth about one woman's death would lead to this, to a scholarship program, to young women being empowered to pursue their dreams, to a legacy of education and hope built on top of tragedy." He paused, looking out at the faces in the gymnasium. There were young girls, some no more than 8 or 9 years old, who had no idea who Sarah Henderson was, who had never heard of the case, but who would benefit from her legacy in ways they might never fully understand. "What I learned from the Henderson case," Marcus continued, "is that justice isn't just about catching criminals or punishing wrongdoing. Justice is about remembering. It's about refusing to let the dead be forgotten. It's about building something good from the ruins of something terrible." Sarah Henderson died in 1942. But through this scholarship, through the lives of the young women it has supported, through the students they have taught and will teach, Sarah Henderson is still alive. Her legacy lives on. Her death, which was senseless and cruel, has been transformed into something that creates life and possibility and hope. After the ceremony, Marcus spent time talking with the scholarship recipients, listening to their stories. There was a young woman named Aisha who was now a high school teacher in Atlanta, mentoring students from the same neighborhood she'd grown up in. There was Maria, who had become a university professor of education, developing new curricula for underserved schools. There was Keisha, who had founded her own nonprofit organization dedicated to providing educational support to at-risk youth. These women, all of them, traced their beginnings back to Sarah Henderson. Back to a woman who had died 77 years ago. Back to Marcus's obsession with solving an unsolved case. That evening, Jennifer took Marcus to dinner at a small restaurant near the river. They sat by a window overlooking the water, watching the lights of Louisville reflect off the dark surface below. "I wanted to tell you something," Jennifer said as they waited for their food. "About 3 years ago, I was contacted by a researcher from the University of Louisville. She was writing a dissertation about cold cases and the role of detective persistence in solving them. The Henderson case was her primary focus. She interviewed me about the scholarship, about how it had changed my life." "That's nice," Marcus said, sipping his water. "Well, after her dissertation was completed, she published it as a book," Jennifer continued. "It's called 53 Years, Justice Delayed in the Sarah Henderson Murder. It's been used in criminology programs across the country. It's teaching new detectives about the importance of never giving up on cases, about the power of modern forensic technology, combined with old-fashioned persistence. You're in that book. You're kind of a hero in it." Marcus laughed quietly. "I don't feel like a hero. I feel like an old man who was stubborn about a case." "That's what makes you a hero," Jennifer said. "Real heroes aren't people who set out trying to be heroic. They're people who are simply unwilling to accept injustice. They're people who pursue truth even when it's inconvenient, even when it costs them something personally. That's what you did." After dinner, Marcus returned to his apartment. He was tired. The kind of tiredness that comes from age and from the weight of accumulated memories. But he felt something else too. He felt a sense of peace that he'd never quite experienced before. He opened a drawer in his desk and pulled out a folder marked Henderson Case Final Documentation. Inside were copies of all the key documents: the grand jury indictment, Eleanor Price's testimony, David Massey's letter, the diary entries, photographs. He'd kept these documents throughout his retirement, unable to quite let go of the case even after it was officially closed. But tonight, looking at them, Marcus realized something. He didn't need to hold on to these documents anymore. The case was no longer his burden. It belonged to history now. It belonged to the scholarship recipients, to the young women whose lives had been changed by Sarah Henderson's legacy. It belonged to the criminology students who would study it in university classrooms. It belonged to the world. Marcus carefully photographed each document with his digital camera, technology that hadn't existed when he was actively investigating, and uploaded them to a secure cloud storage. Then slowly and deliberately, he shredded the original documents. Not out of a desire to erase the case, but out of a recognition that he could finally let it go. 2 weeks later, Marcus received a letter from David Massey. They had maintained a quiet correspondence over the years, periodic letters in which Massey would update Marcus on the scholarship fund and ask how Marcus was doing in retirement. This letter was different. David had passed away peacefully in his sleep. His family was writing to inform Marcus of his death and to request that Marcus attend the funeral. In his will, David had left a significant additional donation to the Sarah Henderson Memorial Scholarship Fund, bringing the total endowment to an amount that would guarantee the fund's continuation for generations to come. At the funeral, Marcus was introduced to David's grandchildren. They were kind and thoughtful people who had grown up understanding that their grandfather had made a terrible mistake in defending a murderer, but who also understood that he had tried to atone for that mistake. They spoke about how the scholarship fund had become a point of family pride, how it represented redemption, how it transformed a family legacy of crime into a legacy of support for education. That same year, Eleanor Price passed away quietly at the age of 104. She had lived long enough to see the scholarship fund support nearly 100 young women. She had lived long enough to see the Henderson case become a fixture in criminology education, a testament to the power of persistence and truth-telling. She had lived long enough to know that her decision to finally speak after 53 years of silence had mattered in ways she could never have imagined. At Eleanor's memorial service, dozens of people came to honor her memory. Teachers she had inspired, young women who had benefited from the scholarship, members of the Henderson family who came to thank her for finally speaking the truth that had set them free from decades of uncertainty. Marcus sat in the back of the chapel, listening to people speak about Eleanor's courage, her integrity, her unwillingness to let injustice stand unchallenged. He thought about how a single act of courage, delayed though it was, could ripple through time in ways that changed the trajectory of countless lives. In the spring of 2020, as the COVID-19 pandemic began to reshape the world, Marcus received one final gift. A documentary filmmaker had produced a feature film about the Henderson case. It was titled The Weight of Years, The Sarah Henderson Mystery and the Detective Who Never Gave Up. The film premiered virtually during the pandemic, and Marcus watched it from his apartment, seeing his younger self on screen, seeing the investigation unfold, seeing the moment when Eleanor Price finally decided to speak the truth. Watching the documentary, Marcus was struck by how much had changed and how much had remained the same. The case itself was now historical, something that happened in a different era to different people in a different world. But the core truth remained unchanged. A woman had been murdered. Her killer had walked free for decades, and a detective, through persistence and dedication, had finally brought her story to light. In the final years of his life, Marcus was diagnosed with cancer in 2021 and passed away peacefully in 2023. At the age of 83, he received countless messages from people whose lives had been touched by the Henderson case. Young women who had become teachers because of the scholarship, detectives who had pursued cold cases because of his example, family members of unsolved murder victims who had been inspired to push for investigations into their own cases. At Marcus's funeral, attendees included people from all corners of the Henderson case investigation. Jennifer Williams and the scholarship recipients she had helped mentor, members of the Henderson family, colleagues from his decades as a detective, criminology professors who had taught his case to generations of students. The eulogies focused on Marcus's persistence, his refusal to accept injustice, his willingness to dedicate years of his life to pursuing truth for a victim he had never met. But what struck most people was how much Marcus's work had extended beyond the solving of a single case. Through the scholarship fund, through the educational impact of his investigation, through the lives that had been changed by his obsession with justice, Marcus had created a legacy that would outlive him by decades. In 2024, 82 years after Sarah Henderson's murder, the Sarah Henderson Memorial Scholarship celebrated its 30th anniversary. Over 200 young women had received the scholarship. Many had gone on to become teachers, professors, education administrators, advocates for educational equity. Collectively, they had taught hundreds of thousands of students. They had changed the trajectory of countless lives, and it all traced back to a single moment in 1988, when Detective Marcus Webb had found a leather wallet in an evidence locker and refused to let a 53-year-old mystery remain unsolved. Sarah Henderson's photograph still hangs in the police department's cold cases division, but now it shares space with a plaque honoring Marcus Webb's legacy. Beside Sarah's photograph is the photograph of Eleanor Price, with a quote from her final interview: "The dead don't rest easy until we remember them. That's what justice really is, remembering, telling the story, refusing to let the world forget." The Henderson case had transformed from a tragedy into a triumph. Not a triumph of vengeance or punishment. Raymond Massey would never face a courtroom, would never be formally sentenced. But a triumph of truth, of remembrance, of building something beautiful from the ashes of something terrible. A triumph measured not in convictions or sentencing, but in the lives of young women who had been empowered to pursue their dreams, in the students they had taught, in the ripples of positive change that continued to spread outward through time. And somewhere, in whatever lies beyond this life, Sarah Henderson could finally rest, knowing that she was remembered. Knowing that her death, though senseless and cruel, had been transformed into a legacy of hope and possibility. Knowing that the truth, pursued with patience and dedication, had finally found its voice.